Hi everyone, sorry for the abrupt ending on part one. From now on, there will be end slides from here on out. I'm still learning as I go along through here. So um, this is evolution part two. We're going to be talking about Darwin today. And we got a bunch of evidence for evolution in part one. So now we're going to see where that evidence led Darwin to come up with Darwin's theory of evolution. Um, So, first, Charles Darwin is known as the father of evolution. He wrote the book On the Origin of Species. Now, believe it or not, he wasn't the only one who was working on the theory or a theory of evolution during this time period. There was actually another author as well, and Darwin actually had to rush his findings in order to publish first. Even though there were other scientists who are naturalists who were working on this exact same theory. Obviously a little bit different, but Darwin got his in first. But it's actually pretty interesting, the race to publish the first book on evolution. The book on the origin of species is super, super boring, and if you ever have trouble falling asleep, you should read it. It will absolutely help you. However, Darwin basically knew that he was going against the teachings of the time, and he was going against the church. And basically, when you went against the church during this time in the history of the world, you got thrown in jail, sometimes forever, or you got put to death. So he knew that he needed to write something that was very precise, very specific, and backed up with facts. Every single thing he wrote, he backed up with evidence that he had found. So in that case, it makes the book very scientifically factual and very evidence-based, which is wonderful, but it also makes it for a very dry and very boring book. He basically got all of his information or evidence for evolution on a ship called the Beagle. The Beagle was a ship that was meant to go around and to categorize and look at other places where the British or the British Empire may expand its rule more or less, or have other places to trade, etc. So it was on basically a finding mission, and also to map a lot of the waters as well. Now, the 6 main points of Darwin's theory look like this. First, overproduction. All organisms produce more offspring than are needed to replace the parents. And the reason is very simple. Not all of those offspring are going to live to reproductive age. So, for example, rabbits have many offspring because rabbits, of course, are food for some other organisms. And basically, they have more than what they need in order to make sure that at least, or hopefully at least, that some survive. Now, since there are so many or so limited resources, there's only so much water, there's only so much living space, there's only so much food, there's only so much places or mates that can be found. So there's all this competition. And this competition leads to certain offspring being better adapted to live in or survive in those conditions. And those offspring that are better adapted have variations. All right, they have mutations, they have different mixes of genes that allow them to be better at living in certain environments. And those genes are inheritable, they're passed down. And those adaptations or those variations lead to adaptations which allow them to be able to be better adapted to survive. If you're better adapted to survive, you have more time to reproduce. If you have more time to reproduce, you're passing down your genes that are better adapted to that environment. And finally, or not finally, but almost finally, natural selection. Nature selects, natural selection. Nature selects for what traits are going to be successful. If you have successful traits, you are going to be the one that reproduces and passes on those successful traits. If nature or natural selection, if nature changes, that means natural selection will change for the traits that are being favorable as well. So for all of a sudden, this is what you're going to be doing in your moth simulation, you're going to be looking at what happens when nature changes and what traits are then favorable as nature changes. In this case, nature changes due to humans, but nature is changing nonetheless. So that's what you'll be looking at in your moth simulation, is how natural selection affects which variations are selected for, which means that which adaptations are best for the environment, which means that which adaptations are passed down from generation to generation. Finally is speciation, is the last point in Darwin's theory. Over many generations of natural selection favors certain adaptations which can accumulate into a formation of a new species. Sometimes not. And we'll talk about how that all works together. So this is what we're going to be focusing on. This set of PowerPoint slides is Darwin's 6 main points and how those main points have led to different organisms that we see today. So there are different ways that scientists believe species evolve. Species can evolve either gradually, which evolution occurs slowly over long periods of time, made up of gradual accumulations of small variations. Or we can have what's called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium, just like it sounds, everything stays the same until a certain period, and then in that period, very fast evolution occurs. A very brief or rapid period of evolution occurs. And if we started thinking about what we talked about before with those mass extinctions would cause what is known as punctuated equilibrium. And really what it comes down to is that both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium are probably working together to create the evolution that we know and see today. By the way, that link does not work anymore, so don't worry about trying to copy that or write it down. That link at the top is no longer useful. So the 4 major mechanisms that drive evolution are natural selection, which nature is selecting what traits; mutations, which are very important because mutations produce new traits or new versions of a trait that weren't there before. Now, naturally, we think of mutations as bad. We don't want mutations to occur, but some mutations are useful. Without mutations, we wouldn't have humans, we wouldn't have all the different variations that we see today, all right? Finally, gene flow and genetic drift, which we will talk more about in future slides. Natural selection. Over time, nature selects, or natural selection results in changes in inherited characteristics of a population, like we've said already. These changes increase in the species' fitness or ability to survive. Now, Darwin talked about survival of the fittest. Now, Darwin's version, or Darwin's survival of the fittest, is not the same thing as we think of being fit. You don't have to be the fastest or the smartest or the one that jumps the highest or the one that does the most push-ups. That is not the fittest. The fittest, in Darwin's terms, is the one that survives and reproduces. All right. If you have passed on your genes, in Darwin's terms, you are considered to be fit for the environment. All right. So survival of the fittest is survival of the organisms that have survived and passed on their traits to the next generation, or their genes to the next generation. The environment causes struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, which is known as natural selection. Variation. Variation is very important to natural selection because that variation allows for natural selection to occur. Natural selection is selecting for certain traits or for certain variations. And we have different sources of those variations. Like I said before, random mutations or random changes in DNA is one of the ways that we get variation. Those variations may or may not be helpful. Most of the time, mutations are not helpful for the survival of the organism. Sometimes they are. And if those changes occur in the right cells in the body, such as the sex cells, those variations can be passed on to the next generation and make them more successful in the environment. Gene shuffling, of course, through sexual reproduction, we see that you are a mix, or that organisms are a mix of their parents, the male and the female that created them. So that random shuffling of genes may create a better version or a better mix of genes to be able to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on. Migration of genes into or out of a population. Now, believe it or not, that is actually very important in the survival of organisms. Bringing new genes in that may be better adapted, or taking those genes away, may cause a species to go extinct, or a species in that area to go extinct, because genes have left that are successful for that species in that area. In small populations, individuals that carry a particular allele may leave, an allele is just a version of a gene, may leave more descendants than other individuals just by chance. Over time, a series of chance occurrences of this type can cause an allele to become common in a population. That's all genetic drift is. It's basically random increases in certain traits. Because not all traits are going to be acted upon by natural selection. Now, the steps to evolution by natural selection look like this. Genetic variation is added to a genotype by mutation. That mutation leads to changes in the phenotype, how that gene is expressed. That phenotype is acted upon by natural selection, whether or not nature selects for or against. And that can be as simple as something like a peacock who has larger tail feathers, which that genetic mutation leads to larger tail feathers, which leads to a female being more attracted or seeing larger tail feathers as being advantageous to survival, and allowing reproduction or more reproduction to occur with that individual that has the mutation for larger tail feathers. He then passes down those traits to his offspring, and larger tail feathers now is something that continues through the population. All right. So it can be as simple as something that a female sees as being more desirable. All right. Individuals more suited for the environment produce more offspring. Therefore, they contribute more to the gene pool of the population. The population gene pool changes over time. And speciation may occur if geographic and reproductive isolation exists. And reproductive isolation can be as simple as a population that has been transferred over a mountainside, has been able to migrate over a mountainside, or a stream or a river begins to infiltrate or change the environment, or where the two species the species were intermating, and the river comes through and now separates those. And now I know that it takes a long time to create a river. So this is over long periods of time. Remember that. So we have three different types of natural selection. We have directional selection, which is when a natural selection favors a single trait and therefore shifts in one direction. We have stabilizing selection, which actually decreases genetic variation in populations and can be bad if the environment changes, which decreases the genetic diversity as the population stabilizes on a particular trait. And finally, we have disruptive selection, which causes the traits at the ends, the least favorable traits, to all of a sudden be adaptive, which makes them the most favorable traits, and all of a sudden the populations begin to increase at those extremes of the population, which we'll look at graphs for all of this next. And that is also known as a disruptive, is known as diversifying selection as well. So we have our original population of brown mice. We have light brown mice at this end, we have dark brown mice at this end, and we have brown mice in the middle. So for the original population, brown is the most common color, which means it is the most successful, which means it passes on its traits the most often to its offspring. However, light brown mice still survive and dark brown mice still survive as well. Now, if we have a directional selection change, that means the environment is no longer selecting for brown mice, it's selecting for darker brown mice. And all of a sudden, we see the shift of those darker brown mice, and now we lose the light brown mice, but we maintain three, and the brown, or the very light and the light brown mice we lose because of that directional selectional change. Skipping D and going right over to C, we have the stabilizing selection, which ends up getting rid of the outliers of the population, which decreases genetic diversity and can be bad if the environment changes, like directional selection, and all of a sudden the brown mice die, and now there are no darker brown mice or lighter brown mice to survive in the new environment. And so that can be a bad thing, as directional selection decreases genetic diversity. Now, anytime there's a decrease in genetic diversity, that's actually bad for a population's chances of survival. Finally, we have diversifying selection, in which both ends, I'm going to erase here for a second. Oh, I should be careful about choosing. Where's my eraser? There it is. Let's erase these for a second. There we go. Now, directional selection. Let's go back. Diversifying selection selects for the outliers, in this case light brown and dark brown. And so you see that because there's only so much food and there's only so much water, there's only so much living space, only so many mice can survive. So when the environment changes and selects for these dark brown and light brown mice, that means the numbers of brown or brown mice are going to decrease. Maybe not all the way, but maybe all the way as well. And we end up with two separate populations possibly, and eventually two separate species given enough time. Now, this is an example of directional selection right now. So we had pests. They're the bugs that eat our plants, etc. We created pesticides. Pesticides kill most of the bugs. They don't kill all the bugs because some of the bugs have mutations that allow them to survive. So what we have done is we have actually caused a directional selection of pesticide resistance within those bugs because we have changed the environment to make pesticides. Pesticides killed off all the bugs that weren't resistant to the pesticides. The only ones that survived were the pesticide-resistant bugs. They reproduced, passed on their pesticide resistance to their offspring, and now we have pesticides that no longer work. So now we have to come up with new pesticides, all right? And now we have a pest resurgence because our pesticides aren't working. Same thing with antibiotics. Antibiotics were overused, I should say, and it caused all the bacteria that were not resistant to antibiotics to die. That actually created an environment where the antibiotic-resistant bacteria were able to not only survive, but because there was no competition with the other antibiotic non-resistant bacteria, that means we took care of the competition, we got rid of the competition, and we allowed the antibiotic-resistant bacteria to not only survive, but then they reproduced, passed on their antibiotic-resistant traits to the offspring, and we directly selected for antibiotic-resistant bacteria by creating antibiotics. So this is evolution as we are seeing it right now happen in front of us. Gene pools. Gene pool is a combination of genetic information where all the members of that particular population is taken into account. So for example, we could talk about the gene pools of our classroom. And we could talk about the number of people that have brown hair and the number of people that have brown eyes, the number of people that have blonde hair, and the number of people that have brown eyes, the number of people that have blonde hair with blue eyes, etc. You get the idea. So the genetic information in a certain area. Now, you can take whatever area you want to look at. You could take at the classroom, you could take the first floor of the school, you could take the entire school. So obviously, the larger you get in your numbers, the more genetic variation that you have in that gene pool. A gene pool typically has 2 or more alleles for every given trait, 2 or more variations for every given trait. And if and when you decide to take genetics, which hopefully I'll still be teaching, which is next year, you take a look at what are called those different alleles and what makes up those alleles. And if at least 1% of the population has those different traits, it's not considered a mutation, it's considered an allele, even though it was caused by, originally, a mutation in the population. Homozygous lethal traits, remember homozygous is when you have the same trait, can be carried by heterozygous individuals and remain in the gene pool. These are known as recessive traits. And what happens is when these 2 recessive traits, when these 2 heterozygous individuals reproduce and these 2 recessive traits get together, they are lethal and they cause death, as in Tay-Sachs disease that we talked about before. Relative frequency is the number of times allele occurs in a gene pool as compared to the number of times other alleles occur. For example, we can look at the relative frequency of brown eyes as compared to any other color, blue eyes as compared to any other color. And we know that brown eyes is the dominant gene, so we actually have brown eyes in more people in the population than we do blue. Blue is a recessive trait. So, not to end on a quick ending like I did last end, this is the end of our PowerPoint narration. You might want to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You do not have to say subscribe forever, but for the rest of the school year, that may be smart. That way, anytime I upload something, you will get a notification of that upload so that you can keep track and follow my PowerPoint presentations, narrations. If these are not helpful, you absolutely do not have to watch them / listen to them. If they are helpful, that's great. I hope that they are, and hope everybody's staying safe and healthy.